The pirate they were hunting was not a man. That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is the fact that the colonial courts of Nassau and Port Royal could not quite bring themselves to process cleanly when they finally had her in custody. The year was 1720. The charges were piracy on the high seas, robbery, and murder. The accused sat in a Kingston courtroom wearing no disguise, no concealment, nothing borrowed from any masculine wardrobe. She had been fighting in men's clothing for months at sea, but she was not hiding now. She was simply there. And the court, built entirely around the assumption that piracy was a male crime, did not have a comfortable category for what it was looking at. Her name was Anne Bonny. And before this is a story about a woman who became a pirate, it needs to be a story about what the world she was born into offered women who had nothing, wanted more, and refused the only door left open to them. Because that is the real story, not the romance, not the sword, not the legend that would accumulate around her name in chapbooks and broadsheets within months of her trial. The real story is structural. It is about what colonial society in the early 18th century considered a woman to be, what it considered her worth, and what happened when one woman decided that the answer to both questions was unacceptable. Anne Bonny was born somewhere around 1698, likely in County Cork, Ireland, though the exact date and circumstances of her birth are disputed and reconstructed, largely from the legal records of her trial, and a single contemporaneous account published in 1724 by a captain and writer named Charles Johnson, whose general history of the pirates remains the primary narrative source for her life. Johnson was not a disinterested chronicler. He wrote for an audience that wanted danger and spectacle, and he gave them both. Historians treat his account as a mixture of documented fact, second-hand testimony, and deliberate embellishment. Where Johnson's story can be cross-referenced against court records, it holds reasonably well. Where it cannot, it should be read carefully. What is documented is this. Anne arrived in the Bahamas as a young woman, already carrying the weight of an irregular birth. Her father, a lawyer named William Cormack, had brought her and her mother to the colonies after a scandal in Cork made remaining untenable. He eventually built modest prosperity in the Carolinas. When he died, Anne may have inherited something, or very little. The record is unclear. What is clear is that by the time she appears in the historical record as an adult, she is in Nassau, married to a small-time sailor named James Bonny, living in a port city that was simultaneously the most lawless place in the Atlantic world, and, for a woman without money or standing, one of the most constrictive. Nassau in 1718 was the last gasp of the Golden Age of Piracy. Woodes Rogers had just arrived as royal governor with a mandate to end it. The world was tightening, and Anne Bonny, trapped inside a bad marriage in a city built on disappearing freedom, was about to make a decision that courts would later call criminal and history would never quite finish arguing about. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. To understand what Anne Bonny chose, you first have to understand what she was choosing against. The British colonial world of the early 18th century had a very precise idea of what a woman was, legally speaking. She was a dependent. Under the doctrine of coverture, which English common law had carried intact across the Atlantic and applied with particular rigidity in colonial courts, a married woman had no independent legal existence. She could not own property in her own name. She could not sign contracts. She could not initiate legal proceedings without her husband's involvement. Whatever she had brought into a marriage, whatever she earned inside it, whatever she inherited during it, belonged by law to her husband. She was not a citizen in any functional sense. She was an attachment. This was not merely philosophical. It had daily, material consequences that shaped every hour of a woman's life. If her husband was violent, she had limited legal recourse. If he was incompetent, she shared his poverty without remedy. If she left him, she left without her children, without her property, and without legal standing in whatever community she entered next. Running was not escape. Running was simply a different kind of trap, one with fewer walls but no floor. James Bonny, Anne's husband, was by most accounts a man of small ambitions and large grievances. Johnson describes him as an informer, someone who traded intelligence about former pirates to Woodes Rogers' administration in exchange for favor and protection. Whether that characterization is entirely accurate is difficult to verify. What is documented is that the marriage was a failure, that Anne sought connection elsewhere, and that Nassau's social structure offered her almost no legitimate path out of it. Divorce in the colonial Bahamas was not impossible, but it was rare, expensive, and socially devastating for the woman involved. There was one formal mechanism available, a practice sometimes called wife sale, which was less a legal proceeding than a public negotiation, in which a husband could release his wife to another man by mutual agreement, sometimes in exchange for payment. It was not sanctioned by formal law. It was not dignified. It was the closest thing to an exit that a woman in Anne's position could access without simply vanishing. Rogers himself was reportedly approached about formalizing such an arrangement between James Bonny, Anne, and a man named John Rackham, the pirate captain she had by then begun a relationship with. Rogers refused. The answer was no. The door was closed. What the colonial system was telling Anne Bonny in that moment was simple and total. You belong to this man, and there is no lawful mechanism by which you can stop belonging to him. You may not leave cleanly. You may not begin again. You may not trade one life for another. Your body, your labor, your future, they are his, because you signed a document once and the law has no interest in what you feel about it now. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, not to generate sympathy by decree, but because the choice that followed cannot be understood without it. What Anne Bonny did next was not impulsive. It was logical. It was the only remaining direction in which there was any open space at all. She left anyway. She left without permission, without legal cover, and without any illusion that the world she was entering would be safer than the one she was leaving. She went to sea with Rackham on a stolen sloop, and in doing so, she crossed a line that the colonial courts would eventually make her answer for in full. Life aboard a pirate vessel in 1719 was not romantic. It was wet, cramped, physically punishing, and structured around a kind of violent democracy that existed nowhere else in the Atlantic world. Pirate ships operated under written articles, internal codes negotiated among the crew that divided plunder by share, outlined punishments for theft or desertion, and in some cases guaranteed compensation for injuries sustained in combat. The quartermaster held power over the captain in certain decisions. Votes were taken. Disputes were adjudicated. It was lawless in relation to the outside world and surprisingly governed within itself. For someone stepping onto that deck from a life defined by legal invisibility, the internal logic of a pirate ship was, in its own brutal way, more equitable than anything the colonial world had offered her. Anne Bonny did not hide what she was. This is one of the more significant and documentable facts about her. Unlike other women of her era who went to sea in male disguise, binding their bodies and constructing false identities over years of sustained performance, Anne appears to have been known among the crew as a woman. Johnson states this directly, and the trial record does not contradict it. The crew of the sloop William knew. They had chosen, collectively, to accept it. This was not standard. The articles of most pirate crews formally prohibited women aboard, partly from superstition, partly from the practical fear of the conflicts that could arise in close quarters. That Rackham's crew set that prohibition aside says something about the particular culture of that vessel, and something about Anne herself. What she actually did aboard the ship is harder to document precisely. Johnson claims she dressed in men's clothing during combat, took active part in fighting, and handled weapons with competence. Some historians accept this as broadly credible, given the physical demands of shipboard life and the absence of any contemporary account that contradicts it. Others treat it as embellishment, the kind of detail that made for better chapbook copy. What can be said is that no contemporary source describes her as passive or as a passenger. The trial record, spare and procedural as it is, does not treat her as incidental. She was charged as a participant. She was prosecuted as someone who had been functionally present and functionally dangerous. She was also not alone in her unusualness on that ship. Mary Reed was also aboard, also documented in the trial record, also a woman who had spent significant portions of her life operating in male spaces under male identities. Reed's history, as Johnson tells it, was longer and more elaborate in its concealment. Years in the military, years of sustained disguise, a whole life constructed around a false gender presentation. The two women knew each other. Whether they were allies, friends, rivals, or simply two people thrown together by circumstance is not something the record resolves cleanly. But their simultaneous presence on the same vessel, known or partially known to the same crew, is documented. It is not legend. The practical reality of Anne's life in this period was defined by motion. The sloop, William, moved through the Caribbean taking small prizes, fishing vessels, merchant ships, coastal traders. The targets were modest. Rackham was not a major figure in the history of Atlantic piracy. His operation was small, opportunistic, and geographically concentrated around Jamaica and the Bahamas. But for Anne, motion itself was the point. Every nautical mile was distance from James Bonny, from coverture, from Nassau, from the life the law had assigned her. The ship was not freedom in any abstract sense. It was freedom in the only sense that has ever mattered, the practical, physical, daily kind. It could not last. It never lasted. The colonial administration had been clear about its intention since Woodes Rogers arrived, and the net that had been tightening around Caribbean piracy for 2 years was still closing. The night of October 22, 1720 is the clearest factual anchor in Anne Bonny's story, and it is not a flattering one. A sloop, commanded by a privateer captain named Jonathan Barnett, acting under authority granted by the governor of Jamaica, caught up with the William near the western tip of Jamaica, in a place called Dry Harbor Bay. What happened next is recorded in the trial testimony of witnesses who were aboard a captured merchant vessel that Rackham's crew had been drinking with earlier that evening. The testimony is spare and procedural, the way court records tend to be, but the outline is consistent across multiple witnesses. Barnett's vessel hailed the William. There was a brief exchange of fire, and then, according to the testimony, most of Rackham's crew went below. Most of the men went below decks. They were drunk. The raid had come at the worst possible moment, after a night of celebration, and the crew of the William was in no condition to fight a coordinated privateer vessel crewed by sober, armed, and legally sanctioned men. The resistance that was offered, such as it was, came largely from the deck. And the people on the deck, according to witness testimony entered into the court record at the subsequent trial in Jamaica, included Anne Bonny and Mary Reed. There is a version of this story, drawn from Johnson and repeated in almost every subsequent retelling, in which Anne went below and berated the hiding men with contempt, telling them, In language, Johnson renders with editorial sharpness that they were not worth hanging. Whether those were her exact words is impossible to verify. Johnson was not in the hold, but the structural truth behind the anecdote is documented. The women were present on deck during the attack in a way that many of the men were not. That is in the trial record. That is not legend. This moment matters not because it is heroic. It matters because it is precise. Under the worst possible conditions, surprised, outnumbered, facing a vessel with legal authority and superior readiness, Anne Bonny did not disappear. She had spent months performing competence in a world that had never asked it of her, had never offered her a stage on which to demonstrate it, had in fact legally prohibited her from acting as an independent agent in almost any domain. And in the moment when performance gave way to something harder and more immediate, the behavior held. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the thing that is most difficult to fake. They were taken. The William was boarded, its crew captured, Rackham bound and placed under guard. Anne was taken with the rest. The journey to Port Royal was short. The trial was swift. Colonial justice in 1720 moved quickly when it wanted to make a point, and the suppression of Caribbean piracy was a point the Crown very much wanted made. Rackham was tried first. He was convicted on the testimony of the merchant witnesses and hanged at Gallows Point in Port Royal in November 1720. His body was afterward displayed in a gibbet at a small quay near the harbor entrance, which still carries his name on navigational charts. It was a public message, legible to every ship entering or leaving Kingston Harbor, about what the colonial administration intended for those who operated outside its authority. Anne was permitted to see him before his execution, according to Johnson's account. What passed between them, if the meeting happened at all, is not recorded. Johnson gives her a single cold line of farewell, unsentimental to the point of cruelty. Historians disagree about whether to read it as real or as Johnson editorializing. It may be both. The historical record does not require it to be resolved. What the record requires is only that she was there, and that he was gone, and that her own trial was still ahead of her. The trial of Anne Bonny and Mary Red opened in Jamaica in late November 1720, before a Vice Admiralty court convened specifically to process the captured crew of the William. Vice Admiralty courts operated without juries. They were instruments of colonial authority, efficient and largely predetermined in their outcomes when the evidence was as straightforward as it was here. Multiple witnesses had seen the defendants aboard the vessel. Multiple witnesses had seen them active during the raid. The legal question was not complicated. The verdict was not in doubt. Both women were convicted of piracy. The sentence was death by hanging, the same sentence handed to every male member of Rackham's crew who was tried alongside them. And then, both women made the same declaration, separately, that the court was legally required to act upon regardless of its private opinions about the matter. They were both, they stated, quick with child, pregnant, and under English law, a sentence of death could not be carried out on a pregnant woman. The execution had to be suspended until after the birth. The court ordered medical examination. The examinations confirmed both claims. The hangings were stayed. Mary Read died in prison, almost certainly of fever, sometime in early 1721. The prison records are incomplete, and the exact date is uncertain. She was buried in Jamaica. She did not survive long enough for the question of her execution to become relevant again. Johnson reports her death with characteristic brevity, moving past it quickly in a way that feels almost indecent given the weight of what her life had contained. Anne Bonny's fate after this point is genuinely and frustratingly unknown. The historical record goes quiet. There is no documented execution. There is no documented release. There is no prison death record that has been conclusively identified as hers. Several historians have proposed that her father, William Cormac, who had by some accounts rebuilt a degree of prosperity and social standing in the Carolinas, may have intervened, paid for her release, or arranged her transportation out of Jamaican jurisdiction. This is plausible, but unverified. It is the kind of thing that happened in colonial society when a family had money and connections, and a powerful enough motivation to make a problem disappear quietly. It is also the kind of thing that left no clean paper trail precisely because the people arranging it did not want one. What followed, if she survived, is reconstructed from fragments that may or may not belong to the same woman. A later marriage in the Carolinas, a family, a quiet life, an ordinary death in ordinary circumstances sometime in the 1780s is the version that some genealogical research has proposed. Other historians treat this reconstruction with skepticism, noting that the evidence is thin and that the name Anne Bonny was not uncommon. The truth is that we do not know what happened to her after the Jamaican court suspended her sentence. She simply stops being visible to the historical record, which is itself a kind of statement about how colonial society processed inconvenient women once they had served their purpose as cautionary examples. The trial had done its work. Rackham was displayed in a gibbet. His crew was hanged. The message about piracy was sent and received. Anne Bonny, having declared her pregnancy and survived the immediate machinery of colonial justice, became a loose end. And loose ends, particularly female ones, were easier for the historical record to lose than to resolve. What the court wanted was order restored and authority demonstrated. What it got, in Anne Bonny's case, was a verdict without a clean ending, a sentence that could not be carried out. A woman who walked into the documentary record through a courtroom door and walked out of it without anyone recording clearly where she went. The colonial justice system, which had been so certain about what she was and what she deserved, could not quite finish the sentence it had started. There is a habit in historical storytelling of ending lives like Anne Bonny's with a kind of borrowed resolution, a final paragraph that tells you what it all meant, what the lesson is, what the arc delivered. This story does not have that. The arc does not close. The woman disappears from the record mid-sentence, and the silence that follows is not poetic. It is administrative. It is the silence of a system that had no further use for her once the public hanging it wanted could not be carried out. But the silence is itself the point. What Anne Bonny's life exposes is not the exceptional nature of one rebellious woman. It exposes the ordinary structural violence of the world she was born into, a world so thoroughly organized around the legal nullification of a woman that the only spaces offering anything resembling agency existed entirely outside the law. The pirate ship was not a utopia. It was violent, precarious, built on theft, and capable of genuine cruelty toward the people its crews preyed upon. None of that disappears because a woman found more room to move on its deck than she'd ever been offered on land. Both things are true simultaneously, and flattening either one produces a story that is less honest than the facts deserve. The colonial Atlantic world of the early 18th century did not force Anne Bonny into piracy the way a single locked door forces a specific choice. It was more diffuse than that, and more total. It was a system that made legal personhood contingent on gender, that bound a woman's economic existence to her husband's legal identity, that offered no clean exit from a bad marriage and no legitimate path toward self-determination for a woman without inherited wealth or powerful family intervention. The pressure was not dramatic. It was constant and ambient and built into every institution she encountered, every court, every church, every social contract the colonial world had written and enforced. What she found outside that system was not freedom in any complete sense. It was operational space, the ability to move, to act, to be present in a moment of danger and respond to it with something other than submission. The fact that this space existed only on a stolen sloop operating in violation of imperial law is not incidental. It is the precise measure of how little space the legal world had left her. Mary Reed's life, running parallel to Anne's and ending in a Jamaican prison cell, makes the same argument from a different angle. Red had spent years constructing a male identity in order to access military service, wages, and mobility, things that required no construction for any man born into the same circumstances. The performance was total and sustained, and, by Johnson's account, remarkably successful. And yet the end point was the same courtroom, the same charges, the same verdict. The system that had excluded both women ultimately reclaimed them through the only institution that moved faster than they could, the law. What endures from Anne Bonny's story is not the romance that the chapbooks wanted to sell, and not the feminist icon that later centuries wanted to find, and not the cautionary tale that the colonial court intended to produce. What endures is something quieter and more uncomfortable. It is the outline of a system made visible by the person who refused to stay inside it. The pressure is always more legible at the point where something breaks against it. Anne Bonny broke against it completely, lived outside it briefly, was caught by it violently, and then slipped out of its records in a way that even the machinery of colonial documentation could not prevent. She did not escape history. She escaped the part of history that gets written down cleanly. And in the gap between the court record that convicted her and the death record that never came, there is more truth about what the 18th century Atlantic world did to women without money or standing than in any law it ever passed, or any sentence it ever handed down with confidence.